Last but not least, we have Dr. Sarah Shaffer, who is a member of the test science team here at IDA in the Operational Evaluation Division. And she will be talking to us about a meta-analysis they performed looking at various situation awareness measures.
Right. So thank you, and good afternoon. So I'll be talking, as Elizabeth mentioned, about a project we have been undertaking for the past year or so, looking at ways that we can more effectively, systematically, and accurately assess situation awareness in general. In particular, for this project, we were looking at team-level situation awareness. So in terms of the purpose and scope of this part of our project and kind of this project overall, we're interested in looking at situation awareness and its measurement more thoroughly because we come across Department of Defense systems pretty often that either are designed to provide situation awareness as a whole or are meant to kind of promote or enhance situation awareness. And this can be either at the individual or the group level. And in some cases, that is the primary function of that system as kind of described. During test and evaluation, however, we very rarely see any data or any proof or measurement of any kind looking at the impact of that system and its design on operator situation awareness. When we do see data from tests attempting to quantify situation awareness, it can be questionable at best in many cases. So what we are looking at for this portion of the project specifically is a particular method called situation awareness linked indicators adapted to novel tasks, or SALIANT, that is meant to look at situation awareness at the level of the team. Oh, I did that. My bad. It's a very sensitive computer. So what we are interested in here primarily is team level situation awareness, right? But we use the term situation awareness frequently. We use it all the time. I get several emails a week telling me how important this meeting or that meeting is to my situation awareness. So I need to attend it vitally. But we talk about situation awareness in all kinds of contexts in operational testing. And it's especially important in the context of mission teams and team settings in Department of Defense and operational testing. So that's what we'll focus on with this project in particular. But how are we defining situation awareness? What is it? How do we operationalize it? How should we think about it and characterize it? This is something you may have seen before. This is a partial model of situation awareness developed by Micah Ensley. And this is essentially an attempt to quantify the process of situation awareness from the point at which you realize you have a task or a goal or a mission to achieve to the point where you are at the end state making some decision or taking some action to accomplish that task or mission. So at level 1, we are essentially processing raw sensory data. We're talking about your eyes intaking light, your ears processing sound, things like temperature and distance. We're not talking about consciously recognizing the things that are in your environment. We are talking about recognizing consciously that things are there at a basic level. At level 2, we have comprehension. So we have taken this raw data, we have perceived it, we have interpreted it in some way. We are engaging in these higher order cognitive processing functions where we are identifying objects and patterns and evaluating their utility and their meaning and how we may or may not be able to use those in a future decision. At the level of projection, we are talking about some kind of expectation for how we expect the objects and the things in our immediate environment to behave in the future. And we are using those expectations to form or evaluate some kind of problem-solving strategy, to choose some decision, to arrive at our optimal kind of task or mission outcome, right, to achieve our ideal end state. So this is a partial model, as I mentioned, relatively straightforward. The full model is much more complicated. And so we have our three basic levels or stages of situation awareness, but we have all of the factors that impact our situation awareness. So we have things that we have talked about earlier today, things like mental models and schemas, how we can expect situations to play out based on our experiences. We have things that are specific to people and their backgrounds and their training and their abilities and their skill sets and the jobs that they're performing. And we also have up at the top our cognitive processing and how our brains work to use this information, things like the demands placed on us by the tasks we're engaged in, things like how long-term memory and attention work, and the difference between automatic and effortful behavior. And we also have the things that we see very often in operational testing settings, the limits of our technology and how the technology and its capabilities constrain our options and kind of dictate the boundaries that we can behave within. So we're talking about situation awareness at this level, at the individual, right? If we're talking about teams, we are talking about multiple people going through this process constantly. The entire time, a group of people is trying to accomplish a common task. So it becomes much more complicated when we are talking about people working in teams to maintain or use situation awareness. So when we think about team level situation awareness, specifically, we are talking about some kind of objective truth, some ground truth picture of a situation, and we are talking about the product of both those individuals and their own situation awareness, as well as how those people are interacting with one another to form this single collective team level situation awareness or shared understanding. So in talking about why we should try to measure situation awareness, first, we're involved in operational testing and kind of implied with testing that we should be measuring things. We can't infer just by looking at the success or a failure of a mission or a task that situation awareness was good or bad. We also can't assess true system performance if we are not able to distinguish between the effects of things like usability and system functionality on situation awareness in the system and how functional it is in and of itself. And if we're not able to do either of those things, we can't make improvements to system performance or enhance situation awareness and ultimately enhance mission outcomes without measuring. People try to do this and it tends to not work out well. People try to improve systems without having an idea of how they affect situation awareness to begin with, and that can often lead to negative performance outcomes or be a detriment ultimately to the ability of that system to enhance performance and mission outcomes. So previous research on situation awareness, there are several pieces of research out there. There are methods for measuring situation awareness in a systematic way. These range from what we would call direct measures and indirect measures along a few dimensions, right? So we have survey measures. Those include things like scales, questionnaires. We have behavioral measures. These are things like reaction time, how long it takes a person or a team to complete a task, how accurate they are when they're doing that, and physiological measures like eye movement, heart rate. We can use imaging to assess situation awareness. And then we have behavioral indicators like the procedure we'll talk about, SALIANT, where we are having observers look for specific types and sets of behavioral indicators to look at a team's situation awareness. With these indirect methods, we are essentially inferring situation awareness. We can't know what people are thinking about, what they're paying attention to, what they're doing, but we can be sure that the behaviors that they're displaying, the things they're doing, are correlated with users' situation awareness in some way. And for our direct measures, we have query-based measures. So we are essentially conducting a real-time assessment of users' knowledge. We know many times what the ground truth is. We know what people are looking at, what they're using to make decisions and inform their kind of strategies for action. And we can get a more direct level of insight into how things are happening and how people are making those decisions. There are fewer query-based measures in previous research because they are more intensive, they take more time, they are more complex, it takes a lot of preparation. You have to identify these things ahead of time and be able to kind of watch them happen and know what type of information you want from that. So they are more direct indicators, but they are also more difficult. The procedure we're talking about specifically today, SALIANT, is one of those indirect measures. It's behavioral. We can't directly see these things happening. But we focused on this in particular because there is a bit more research on those query-based measures and how reliable and accurate they are. So as a caveat to this, I wanted to provide a general overview of what is out there. By including these on this table, I am in no way saying that all of these are good, right? So they just are, they exist. Some of them have been studied, validated, meta-analyzed, some of them have not, and that is overall kind of the purpose of this project. So I've mentioned SALIANT a few times. What is it? SALIANT was developed by NAVAIR researchers who essentially wanted to have teams work together through some task requiring coordination. And prior to having teams do this, they identified set categories and types of behaviors, as well as kind of more specific behaviors that they could observe and record as teams worked through a simulated event or scenario. So a tabletop exercise, essentially. So they had air crews work through the simulated event. And using this predefined set of behaviors, or what they call behavioral indicators, observers recorded each time a team member or the team as a whole demonstrated one of these behavioral indicators to assess situation awareness. So what do these behavioral indicators look like? At the top in red, we have our general kind of categories of behavioral indicators, things like spatial awareness, problem recognition, information awareness. And then we have subcategories as well. So we're talking about noticing changes in the environment, things like informing team members of intent to act, things like allocating time and attention to specific tasks and delegating work among team members, and effectively sharing workload in accomplishing some team level mission. So to make sure kind of we're all on the same page in terms of how these would look, people tend to sometimes have a difficult time thinking about what these would look like. We'll go through a quick example talking about specifically the category of problem recognition. So suppose we have a team, use the example of an air crew. Suppose that the communication specialist in this team realizes that they no longer have radio contact. In other words, they have identified some problem. That is unique at that point to that operator. So the operator then has to report that information to the rest of the team. Otherwise, the team is not at this single team level shared situation awareness, right? They're sharing information. They're all on the same page. They can act from the most informed place possible. So making that report of recognizing that problem would be a behavioral indicator that a observer would record using this procedure. At that point, say the team realizes and agrees that they need to reestablish contact. They have decided that this is a problem, and it's a problem that has severe enough consequences potentially that they need to address it through some action. So demonstrating that they understand the problem consequences, the consequences of the problem, would be another behavioral indicator that we would look for using the SALIANT procedure. If we then see that the team has collectively talked about it, decided that perhaps that lost radio contact could be due to unexpected weather, right? In other words, they have proposed a potential source for this problem. Locating the problem source would be another one of these, again, behavioral indicators that we would record. So then they propose some solution to this problem. Maybe moving to a higher altitude will correct this problem. We can reestablish contact like we need to. So the pilot informs the rest of the crew that they intend to move to a higher altitude. Again, making sure that the entire team is on the same level in terms of the information that they hold collectively or their shared situation awareness. That report of intending to act, again, sharing information, would be another behavioral indicator that we would record using this procedure. And then at the point that they move to a higher altitude, the action has been performed. This is the attempt to solve the problem. The pilot then updates the rest of the crew on their new position status, again, sharing information, bringing the entire team to the same level, sharing the same information picture is another indicator that we would record while a team was working through some mission or task using this salient procedure. So knowing how this works, the question then is, should we use it? There are a number of methods that have been developed and, as I mentioned, tested, empirically validated, gone through meta-analysis. Salient is not one of those. It was developed around 25 years ago, however long ago 1998 was. There has still been no wider validation of this technique or this methodology and whether it would be a good measurement or metric in operational testing. So that was the goal of this specific project. We wanted to see what the overall literature says and whether there is any indication that there are some merits to salient that would make it a good candidate for use in operational testing. So we performed a meta-analysis with two primary questions. First, we wanted to know whether salient is a reliable measure. If we use this procedure in multiple settings with different groups of people who are doing, on average, the same type of thing, which is to accomplish a task or achieve some mission, do we find similar results across all of those contexts? We also wanted to know whether salient is sensitive. That is, we know that certain factors affect situation awareness. So people who have more training tend to have an easier time maintaining situation awareness than people who have less training, right? So if we used salient procedure, knowing that we have differences in a factor such as operator training, we should be able to detect the effect of that operator training factor if one does in fact exist. And lastly, we had this exploratory question. We wanted to know whether salient is consistent with any of the other situation awareness measures we've seen before. So these being those direct or indirect measures where we are using queries or surveys or behavioral indicators. We would assume if this is a good methodology for looking at this problem, we would find relatively consistent outcomes across different measurements, right? One thing to note here is that this is exploratory in that we know certain types of measures, such as surveys, are likely not exactly measuring situation awareness. They may be more indicators of operators' confidence in their level of situation awareness. You can be very confident that you are situationally aware, but very wrong in that assessment, and in fact, not very situationally aware. So we would expect some change across these different types of measures overall, which is why we kept this as an exploratory kind of question. So to conduct this meta-analysis, we went through your typical meta-analytic steps. We came up with a set of inclusion and exclusion criteria. We found relevant statistics for each of those. We processed that, and we came up with some framework for quantifying and aggregating and comparing those. So to select studies in this sample, we had a set of search criteria, right, and combinations of search terms that we used for every paper that we found. We also wanted each of those papers that we found to cite this original paper where the salient methodology was originally reported on and developed. Once we found papers that fit those criteria, we looked at the references cited by those papers and tried to find other studies to include in our meta-analysis. We ended up with a bunch of different types of research, from published journal articles to dissertations. We read several dissertations, very fun. We conference proceedings, technical reports. However, every one of those used salient in some way to measure team-level situation awareness. And probably the most important part of a meta-analysis or a statistical analysis, they had to report some statistics that we could then use for our own statistical analysis. So we extracted any data or any reported results related to these two primary questions we had regarding reliability and sensitivity. So if a study reported a measure of internal reliability, such as Cronbach's alpha, we took that and recorded it on a per study basis. If it reported some measure of sensitivity, such as an effect size of a factor that was either measured quasi-experimentally or experimentally manipulated, we recorded those as well. And then in terms of consistency, we recorded any correlations reported between outcomes for SALIANT and outcomes for other measures of situation awareness. So some of the studies that we found had multiple tests relevant to our research questions. So we had multiple statistics per paper that we could have used to answer each of these three questions. Some of the studies we found did not have any statistics reported at all. They were entirely qualitative, so we were not able to use those for any kind of meta-analysis. We threw those out essentially for this. Where we had relevant statistics, we kind of aggregated them and quantified them so that we had one statistic per study that we then used to calculate a meta-analytic average, which we analyze using a random effects model, assuming that there are sources of variance or error both within each study and between all of the studies in our sample. So given how different the research we found was, we wanted to make sure that we included some measure that would account for that heterogeneity. At that point, we were able to look at individual results for each of these and compare both the results, our meta-analytic averages, and variance across our studies. So what did we find? We found that there are not that many studies looking at SALIANT and its effectiveness as a measure for situation awareness. 6. Which is not great. Worth noting that these studies, these 6 in our final sample, were the ones that reported results, right? So we had studies reporting some kind of qualitative effect, but they did not report statistics such as Cronbach's alpha or inter-rater reliability. We had no way of extracting any quantitative data. So overall, due to that very unimpressive sample size, we have relatively low statistical confidence, right, in our results. In terms of our first question, looking at internal reliability, does SALIANT measure what we want it to measure across multiple types of situations? Only one study included some relevant statistic. Unsurprisingly, to make some kind of comparison, you need at least 2 of a thing. So we weren't able to address that question, right? So we have no results in terms of reliability. I will note that for this paper specifically, that statistic is extremely high. I'm not going to say it's suspicious or not, but it's very high. I don't think that we can confidently make any conclusions based on what we would expect to find in other situations on that result alone. In terms of factors looking at SALIANT sensitivity and effect sizes specifically, only 2. 2 studies included all of the criteria we required for our analysis, and effect sizes for these ranged from weak to moderate, and they were very different studies. And so we were able to compare 2 whole studies looking at sensitivity. Still less than ideal, I think. For our exploratory question, looking at the correlation between SALIANT and consistency with other situation awareness measures, we had a pretty large array of correlations ranging from almost no correlation whatsoever to no negative correlation to very strong correlation, a little bit all over the place. ultimately, we have no evidence that Salient is sensitive to factors that affect situation awareness. I mentioned we couldn't even measure or conduct any kind of analysis looking at Salient's reliability. So we only had these 2 studies, not significant findings, confidence intervals including 0, meaning if we retested them using potentially a different sample, we would probably find the same thing. So no compelling evidence that Salient is sensitive to these factors. For our third final exploratory question, we found no evidence that Salient is consistent with other measures of situation awareness. Again, only 4 studies, very different. Some used a combination of multiple types of measures. Some had different multiple studies or experiments per study or measure, but still no significant findings for that meta-analysis either. So the conclusions that we can draw based on the existing research and a meta-analysis of that research is that we have no reliable statistical evidence for the use of Salient as a procedure to assess situation awareness in operational testing. We did not find any evidence that is reliable or sensitive or that it is consistent with other situation awareness measures, again, using this very, very somewhat sad final sample size. We do, however, have some anecdotal evidence, which I will talk about in just a minute. But overall, if we're talking about whether we should use Salient or recommend it in an operational testing environment, our answer is kind of maybe, I don't know. It could be good. It could not be good. Who knows, honestly. It may be that if we use different methods to look at the results of these research studies, we could have some insight in either direction. I mentioned we had some anecdotal evidence. We had many studies, more than 6, much more impressive, that tested Salient but did not report any statistical results. Because we were looking at this qualitatively, we couldn't include those here. It could be that if we used a different aggregation method to look at those in a quantitative way, we would have found some different result. We intend to do that in the short term as far as future directions go. So we will be performing a systematic qualitative review where we will include the pieces of research that we weren't able to include here in this meta-analysis. And again, maybe we'll find something, maybe we won't. But in the long term, bigger picture, we will continue to investigate additional measures of team situation awareness. I think take-home wise, situation awareness and measurement of situation awareness and research on situation awareness is not new, right? It's been around at least 25 years, if we go by this one paper. However, it somehow hasn't made it into the operational testing community, despite the emphasis we place on the importance of situation awareness. So not early days for situation awareness research as a whole, but we could be doing better in terms of operational testing, considering situation awareness. We have not gotten there yet, but again, we will continue to work on this. And probably the biggest problem here is that most, if not all, of the data available comes from academic research. It does not come from operational testing. We do not know how this works in really messy kind of OT settings. We don't know generally what this looks like here, and we don't have data to try to figure that out. So in the future, we'll continue to work on this. It's an important problem. It's a really hard to think about and study problem, but it is not an impossible one to study, and it is not an insolvable problem. So we will be looking for people to collaborate with. We will be looking for examples of data that we could include in future parts of this project. And if anyone is interested in contributing to that, we can be contacted here, or any of our test science team can be. And that is about it for me, unless there is questions or time for questions.